A lonely black mechanic named James J. Harrington trudged through the snowstorm, his boots crunching with every step. He was on his way back to his cabin after another long day of repairing vehicles in the village when he heard an eerie sound. A faint cry. His heart quickened as the wind howled around him. He had spent hours fixing a truck for the Sanders family, who had been stranded for the past week. Their father, just a few years older than Jay, had passed away, and now it was the mother, Claire, trying to raise two children under increasingly difficult conditions. Claire had been frantically working to clear a path for their home when Jay had finally finished his work. He waved her off when she tried to hand him a few dollars, telling her, "Keep it for the kids. They'll need it for something warmer." Jay turned toward his truck, tired, but a sense of unease weighed on him. As he drove, the snowstorm worsened, the road ahead becoming a ghostly blur. The windshield wipers squeaked and groaned under the weight of the ice. He kept his eyes on the road, knowing full well the storm could swallow him whole in seconds. The landscape beyond the headlights was nothing but whirling flakes and an impenetrable white haze. It had been a long winter, but this one felt different. Jay was used to the cold, having grown up in these mountains. But something about tonight's storm felt heavier, more dangerous. Jay clenched the steering wheel tighter as he leaned forward, determined to press on. The road to his cabin was treacherous, and with no lights except the dim beams of his truck, he felt like a lone traveler caught in nature's fury. He had learned from an early age that life had no room for weakness. His father had left when Jay was young, and he had learned how to survive on his own. But deep down, there was always a part of him that still believed people needed each other. He had rescued a neighbor's dog from the river once when he was 15, simply because the dog was struggling. His father had always said that real kindness didn't need an audience. Tonight, he might just get a chance to prove that. Block 2. Jay had just parked his truck by the cabin when a faint, distant cry reached his ears. At first, he dismissed it, assuming it was the wind playing tricks. But then, a sharper, more desperate wail followed. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. Someone needed help. Without thinking, he yanked on his heavy coat and boots, grabbing the flashlight by the door. The wind stung his face as he stepped out, the snow already knee-deep. His footsteps were quickly covered by the swirling snow. He squinted, trying to make sense of the white void around him. The cry came again, louder this time. The urgency in it drove him forward. As he reached the side of the road, barely able to see through the storm, his light flashed on a small figure, an older boy, no more than 7, clutching a tiny bundle to his chest. The boy's face was pale with the cold, his lips trembling, but his eyes were determined. Jay's heart clenched. The boy was trying to protect a newborn, wrapped in a soaking wet blanket that had already begun to freeze. Jay knelt down beside them. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice barely audible over the wind. The boy looked up, his face pinched with fear. He didn't speak, but clung tighter to the bundle. Jay could see the small, fragile form of the baby now, breathing weakly. Jay's gaze darted to the side, where a woman lay half buried in snow. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. He reached out to touch her cheek, and it burned against his frozen fingers. Fever. He acted fast. Lifting the woman as if she weighed nothing, he motioned for the boy to follow. "Come on, we're going inside," he said, his voice firm but kind. The boy hesitated, clutching the blanket tighter but eventually stumbled after him, one hand still gripping Jay's coat. Inside the warmth of Jay's cabin, the fire crackled softly, the heat of the stove a welcome relief after the biting cold outside. Jay set the baby on the couch, wrapping him in a thicker quilt while he soaked a cloth in warm water and gently pressed it against the baby's hands and feet. The infant's whimpers softened, but he remained steady, breathing, though still fragile. Jay turned back to the older boy, who hadn't moved from the fire. His eyes darted from the baby to Jay, full of suspicion but also silent gratitude. Jay didn't press him for conversation. Instead, he handed the boy a dry blanket and nodded toward the fire. "Warm up. It's going to be a long night." The boy accepted the blanket, wrapping it around his shoulders as he inched closer to the stove. Jay moved to the woman, gently easing her soaked coat off and replacing it with one of his thick sweaters. He covered her with wool blankets and set a cup of hot water next to her on the floor. The storm raged outside, the sound of wind and snow pounding against the cabin's walls. For a moment, it seemed like the world outside no longer mattered. Inside, there was only the soft crackling of the fire and the quiet warmth that Jay had worked so hard to preserve. When the woman stirred, it was slowly, as if the warmth had to coax her back to consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, first seeking the baby in her arms, then the older boy, and finally resting on Jay. Confusion flickered across her face before it softened into a look of pure relief. Her voice was barely above a whisper, ragged from the cold. You brought us in. Thank you. Jay nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. You're safe now. Just rest. She closed her eyes again, but not before speaking, her voice shaky. We were trying to get to my sister's. My husband died 6 months ago. We stayed in a barn last night, but the roof blew off. I tried to keep going. Her voice faltered, and she drifted back into a shallow sleep. Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire seemed to fill every corner. Jay knew they weren't going anywhere tonight. The storm had them trapped. It didn't matter. For now, there was something much more important to focus on: getting these strangers through the night, keeping them safe. The next morning, the storm showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled against the walls of the cabin, and the windows were blurred white with frost. The world outside was a formless void of snow and ice. Jay stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal as the smell of cinnamon wafted through the air. Behind him, the fire crackled softly, a constant reminder of the warmth that held the storm at bay. Grace, the woman who had been unconscious just hours earlier, was awake now, but her face was drawn with exhaustion. She sat by the fire, cradling her infant son, Eli, close to her chest. Her older son, Noah, sat cross-legged on the rug, wrapped in one of Jay's old flannel shirts. His eyes followed every movement Jay made, wary but curious, like a stray dog trying to figure out if it was safe to trust someone. Jay set a steaming bowl of oatmeal in front of Noah. Careful, it's hot. Noah hesitated for a moment, glancing at his mother. She gave a small, reassuring nod, and only then did Noah scoop a small bite into his mouth, his hands still trembling from the cold, though less so now. Jay poured himself a cup of coffee, then sat down across from Noah. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he told a story from his own childhood, about the time when a blizzard had trapped his family on their farm. We had to dig a tunnel just to get to the barn, he said, a smile pulling at his mouth as the memory warmed him. My father tied a rope from the house to the chicken coop so we wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. You couldn't see 2 feet ahead. Noah's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Did you make it? Jay nodded. We made it. Lost a few shingles, but the chickens were fine. Tougher than they look. The corners of Noah's mouth twitched, as if he was holding back a smile. He quickly hid it behind another spoonful of oatmeal. Jay watched him with a soft smile, glad to see that the boy was starting to relax. Grace, sitting nearby, looked on with a quieter expression, her exhaustion mixed with a trace of relief. They were safe for now, and that was all that mattered. Block 5. Days blended together as the storm raged on. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth of the cabin kept them all alive. Eli's fever slowly subsided, but a new worry crept in. The baby's breathing had started to sound congested, and Grace watched him closely, her heart heavy with concern. Noah stayed close to his brother, refusing to leave his side. Caleb had told her not to worry. He's strong, he said quietly, but we'll keep him warmer still. He made sure the fire burned hot enough to ward off the cold, and he brought extra blankets to ensure the baby was kept warm. Still, Grace couldn't help but watch Eli constantly, her eyes glued to his tiny face, willing him to stay strong. That night, after the fire had burned low and the wind had quieted to a low murmur, Caleb rose from his bedroll. He found Noah sitting by the fire, holding Eli in his lap. The boy was trying to adjust the blankets around his brother, but his hands were clumsy with sleep. Caleb crouched beside him, bringing a towel he had warmed by the stove. Here, he murmured, wrapping it around Eli's chest and feet. This will hold the heat longer. Noah didn't respond, but he stayed beside Caleb until Eli's breathing evened out. The storm was still fierce outside, but for a brief moment, it felt like they were all safe. Together, the storm didn't let up by morning. Snow still piled higher than the windowsills, and the air outside was bitter and cold. Caleb pushed open the door just far enough to confirm that the road had vanished, buried completely by the drifts. The The sky above was low and dark, promising more snow. He closed the door again, looking down at the two sleeping children, curled up beside their mother on the rug. Grace stirred, her eyes meeting Caleb's. Neither of them spoke, but the message was clear. They were snowbound. The world beyond the cabin was shut away, and no one was coming until the storm passed. It was in the deep hours of the night, long after the fire had dimmed to glowing embers, when an unsettling sound broke through the silence. It wasn't the wind, but a sharp, raspy sound, the unmistakable breath of a child in distress. Mariah, now awake and cradling her son Elias in her arms, looked at her older son, Lucas, who had been curled by the fire. His face was drawn with fatigue, but the sounds from Elias made his eyes widen with panic. Mariah whispered, "Something's wrong." Her voice trembled in the stillness, thick with the fear she couldn't hide. Jay was up in an instant, his boots clapping against the floor as he hurried over. Elias's skin was chillingly cold, his breath a rasping wheeze that seemed too shallow. Mariah's heart pounded. She could feel the cold seep through Elias's little body, and her instincts screamed that time was running out. Jay pressed his hand against Elias's tiny cheek, his fingers cold but unmistakably warmer than the baby's skin. "We need to get him to a doctor now," Jay said, urgency in his voice. Mariah shook her head, her grip tightening on Elias as if her very touch could save him. "The roads are blocked. The storm won't let us out." Just as she spoke, an old landline by the door crackled to life. The rescue crew on the other end confirmed what they both feared. There would be no plows or rescue vehicles for hours. The storm had trapped them completely. Mariah's chest tightened, tears welling in her eyes. "He doesn't have hours." Jay, determined and resolute, grabbed a woolen blanket from a nearby chest and began wrapping Elias tightly. "There's a clinic a couple of ridges over," Jay said, his voice soft but firm. "It's a walk. I'll make it faster than any plow." Mariah's eyes met his, full of helplessness and desperation. She clutched her son even closer. "I'm coming with you." Jay hesitated for only a second before nodding. Together, they prepared for what would be the most perilous part of the storm yet. Block 8. The wind howled as they stepped out into the night, the cold instantly biting into their skin. Jay wrapped Elias tightly under his coat, using his own body warmth to shield the infant. Mariah followed closely, the snow swirling in a haze, blinding her with every step. The wind fought them, pushing against their bodies as if nature itself was trying to stop them from moving forward. Elias's breaths were so faint, Jay could barely feel them against his chest. The cold made his own limbs feel like stone, but he kept pushing forward, step by agonizing step, knowing that every second counted. Mariah, struggling beside him, was growing weaker by the minute. Her breaths were shallow, and she stumbled against a snowbank, her legs giving out. "Don't stop," she gasped, her voice nearly drowned out by the wind. Jay scanned the landscape, trying to spot anything that might offer shelter. In the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, he saw the outline of a small hunting shack, half collapsed, but standing. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to break the wind. "We'll make it there," he said, his voice low but determined. Inside the shack, the cold was biting but still. It offered a brief reprieve, a place where they could catch their breath. The wind howled outside, but the walls of the shack kept most of it at bay. It wasn't warm, but it was shelter. No sooner had they stepped inside than Lucas, Mariah's son, staggered in behind them. His cheeks were raw from the cold, his eyes wide with worry. His gaze locked onto his brother, and his face tightened in resolve. Jay set to work, bundling Elias up as best as he could, and checking Mariah's condition. "Stay here, keep him warm," he instructed, his voice low but firm. "I'll come back for you both. Just keep him close." Mariah nodded, her face pale with exhaustion but full of determination. Lucas, who had been silent the whole time, stood beside his mother, his small hand gripping hers tightly. He understood, perhaps more than his age would suggest. The bond between the brothers was clear. There would be no separation. Jay adjusted his scarf and prepared to step back into the storm. "Stay close," he murmured to the boy before walking into the whirling snow once more. The snow seemed to fight against him with every step he took, but Jay wasn't one to back down. He pressed forward, every breath stinging his lungs, the weight of Elias in his arms heavy as if it threatened to drag him down. He kept pushing, one step at a time, his mind fixed on nothing but reaching the clinic before it was too late. Meanwhile, Lucas stayed with his mother, his eyes flickering with fear. He couldn't look away from his brother, his tiny form now bundled tightly in blankets. His heart beat erratically as he fought against the swirling storm in his mind. The mention of sending Elias to someone else to be cared for had sparked a deep, protective instinct inside Lucas, a fear that he couldn't shake. He couldn't let them take his brother away. Not again. Lucas had seen too much loss already. His father, gone too soon, taken from them in a tragic accident. He had promised Elias that he would never let anyone take him away, not even in the midst of this storm. Hours passed. Time felt irrelevant as the storm raged on outside. The small shack seemed to groan under the weight of the snow, the roof threatening to collapse. Then, just as Jay reached the ridge, his legs aching and his breath shallow, he saw it. The faint glow of lights through the blinding snow. The clinic. The sight filled him with a surge of energy, pushing him forward despite the exhaustion pulling at his body. By the time he reached the door, his legs were barely holding him upright. He banged against it, pounding until the clinic staff finally opened it, taking Elias from his arms. Warm hands immediately went to work. Oxygen, blankets, heat lamps, and only when he saw the faintest hint of pink return to the baby's lips did Jay allow himself to exhale a long, shaky breath. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply nodded, grateful that he had made it. Now, all he had to do was get back. Hours later, Jay trudged back through the storm, exhaustion clinging to his bones. The clinic had confirmed that Elias was out of immediate danger. He had done it. But as he made his way back, carrying only the weight of the promise he'd made, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The world, buried under layers of snow, seemed still, waiting. When he returned to the shack, Mariah was sitting near the stove, her face haggard but hopeful. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, she didn't need to ask. She could see it in his face, the quiet relief that only came when a life had been saved. She didn't speak at first, but her lips trembled, and Jay could tell that the storm outside had been nothing compared to the one raging in her heart. She clutched Elias to her chest, her hands warm against his small body. "You brought him back," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Jay nodded, wiping his frozen brow. "He's strong. He's going to be okay." No sooner had he said the words than he noticed Lucas, standing quietly by the door, eyes watching them both. The boy hadn't said a word, but there was a weight in his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that felt almost like fear. Jay understood it immediately. Lucas was still a child, but the events of the past hours had grown him up in ways no one could have predicted. "Your brother's going to be okay," Jay said gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. Lucas didn't answer, but his small hand reached out, hesitating before it landed on Jay's arm. The trust was there, unspoken but clear. Jay smiled faintly, ruffling the boy's hair. Mariah, her eyes tired but full of unspoken thanks, settled Elias into the blankets beside the stove. "We'll be all right now," she said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. "But I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Jay replied softly. "You're safe. That's all that matters." As the hours dragged on, the storm outside raged in fury, but inside the shack, there was a fragile calm. They all huddled together for warmth, sharing what little they had. And for the first time in a long while, Jay allowed himself to relax, knowing that he had made a difference. Even if he had nothing more to offer than his presence, it was enough. Block 11. The storm finally started to subside the next morning, though it left behind an unrecognizable world. Snow piled high against the walls of the shack, and the wind, once ferocious, had calmed to a steady breeze. Jay, now fully awake and refreshed after a short night of rest, made his way outside to check the road. The world beyond was a white wasteland. There were no clear paths, no sign of civilization beyond the cabin and shack. He pushed against the door, stepping out into the cold with a deep breath. The silence outside felt like the calm after a battle, and Jay realized that he wasn't alone anymore. Not in the same way he had been before the storm. There were people in his life now, people who needed him, and whom he had grown to care for in the short time they had been together. He knew that the storm hadn't just buried the land. It had buried something else too, a part of him that had always been content to stay isolated. Now, that part was no longer welcome. Jay spent the rest of the morning making plans with Mariah and Lucas. They would return to town once the roads were passable, but there was no rush. For now, they were safe. Jay made sure the shack was secure, preparing them to leave when the time came. By the afternoon, the sky had cleared somewhat, though the snow still fell lightly, a reminder of the ferocity of the storm that had come and gone. Jay brought in more firewood, tending to the stove while Lucas and Mariah gathered their few belongings. As they readied to leave the shack, Jay glanced out into the horizon. There was still a long road ahead for them all, but somehow, it felt less lonely now. As they made their way back toward town, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered ground. The world was still buried, but it was starting to thaw, just like the fragile connection that had formed between them. The next week, the town slowly began to recover from the storm. The roads had been cleared, and the sun came out to reveal the damage, but also the possibility of renewal. Jay found himself taking on new work around town, repairing small tasks for those who had been affected. He hadn't realized just how much people depended on him, but now it seemed like he was a part of something bigger. Mariah and Lucas found temporary housing, staying with a kind-hearted family that had an extra room. The bond between them and Jay had grown during the storm, and now it was clear that their paths were connected in ways neither of them had anticipated. Jay didn't ask for anything in return for his help. He didn't need thanks. He was content to know that they were safe. It wasn't long before Jay started seeing Lucas more regularly, the boy stopping by his cabin to ask about tools or just to chat. Their bond, though still young, felt unbreakable. Jay taught him how to chop wood properly, how to fix small engines, and little by little, the boy began to open up. Mariah would visit sometimes, offering her thanks with a kind smile, but there was more to it than just gratitude. There was something unspoken between them. One afternoon, as they were all gathered at the local community hall for a meal, Lucas came up to Jay, his hands fidgeting with a small wooden box. "You made it," he said, holding it out to Jay. Jay smiled, taking the box in his hands. It was small, carefully crafted, with a simple but intricate design. "It's perfect," Jay said, his voice soft. "I'm proud of you, kid." Lucas nodded, a slight smile on his lips. "Thanks for everything." As the evening wound down, Jay felt the warmth of the fire around him, the laughter of the people he had come to know, and the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Mariah was there, Elias in her arms, and the future seemed far less uncertain than it had before. The storm had changed them all, in ways they were still figuring out. But as the snow continued to fall outside, Jay knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, they would face it together.